This video is the story of an ocean, a sea that escapes through the air, leaving behind a burning salt desert that will remain in place for nearly 700,000 years, and indirectly allow the appearance of giant rabbits as well as increase the frequency of eruptions of many volcanoes. And the evidence that I'm not just telling you anything while on an acid trip is inscribed in rocks, now buried under the waves. In the early 1970s, deep drilling campaigns and seismic studies conducted in the Mediterranean revealed the extent of a strangeness, namely that almost all of the latter's seabed is not only made up of the sediments that are usually found at the bottom of the oceans, such as mud and sand, but also, and above all, of a lot too much salt. Salt accumulated in deposits, sometimes thousands of meters thick. However, for such accumulations to form, it is necessary that the water in which it bathes has reached, at some point in its history, salinity rates through the roof, or even has completely withdrawn. Since these discoveries, 50 years have passed, and thousands of studies later, we now know, in detail, the extent of the cataclysm that unfolded in this sea. So here is the story of the appearance and destruction of what was perhaps one of the most surreal landscapes that Earth has ever borne. A salt desert the size of a small continent, located nearly 2,000 meters below the average level of the oceans, and which, while it may seem to come straight from another planet, did indeed exist on this world. It even remained there for nearly 700,000 years, and I think it's high time to take a leap in time. The story begins some 7 million years ago. The Mediterranean Sea is roughly the same size as we know it today. The difference is that it was then connected to the Atlantic Ocean by 2 and 3 passages at what would later become the Strait of Gibraltar. As the African plate pushes north, beneath the surface a few hundred kilometers deep, a piece of lithosphere sinking into the Earth's mantle breaks off, causing in reaction, over a few thousand years, the uplift of the Iberian plate. And now the southern corridor narrows, then closes. 500,000 years later, through the play of tectonic forces, the African plate, which continues to push, comes to bring up and expose on the surface a part of the seabed of the northern corridor until it almost completely isolates the Mediterranean from the Atlantic Ocean. Now cut off from the water supply coming from the vast ocean, the sea will flee through the air, gradually evaporating. Because the Mediterranean of the time, like today's, is largely supplied with water by the rains that fall there, the rivers and streams that flow into it, but also and especially by the waters coming from the Atlantic. However, once this tap is closed, rivers, streams, and precipitation that pour into it are unable to compensate on their own for the evaporation processes that each year tear away from the Mediterranean some 3,000 cubic kilometers of water. It is believed that in a few millennia, the Mediterranean's level will decrease by almost 1,000 meters in certain areas. Wait a few thousand more years, and you could literally walk on the ocean floor, 2,500 meters below the average level of the oceans. In place of the now nearly vanished bloodless sea, there is a huge basin. And as far as the eye can see, almost everywhere on the horizon, there is salt left behind by the evaporated water. Here and there, in this desert covered with burning salt crusts the size of a continent, huge masses of evaporates emerge, and very rarely do we find streams on these exposed seabeds, because the ancestors of the Rhone and the Nile, like all the rivers around the Mediterranean, continue to flow. The sea into which they used to flow having disappeared, they now carve at their mouths canyons several hundred meters deep, in which they flow and crisscross, now below the average level of the world's oceans. From their powerful occasional flood, they erode, and by tearing the rocks from the crust by the force of their flow, they would painfully make their way to the heart of the dried-up furnace to feed immense ephemeral stagnant ponds or gigantic salt lakes that lie in the deepest parts of the Dead Sea. We still find today the traces of the raw forces of these rivers which, although having been masked since by their own sediments, are always inscribed, marked in the seismic surveys of the geological layers. Thus, 2,000 meters under the city of Cairo, where the Nile Delta was located at the time, the imprints left by deep incisions that then extended 700 kilometers into the vanished sea were found. The ancestor of the Rhone, at that time, carved with its waters a canyon nearly 400 kilometers long and plunging 1,100 meters below the average level of the oceans. We even discovered, in deep basins of the eastern Mediterranean, an ancient river network drawn by the flow of a river that no longer exists and had its source in the south of present-day Turkey, before meandering through thick salt deposits for more than 500 kilometers, to finally spread out in the form of a delta precisely where there is now a submarine mountain lying 2,700 meters deep. The presence of these ancient river and riverbeds, currently buried under several thousand meters of seawater, testifies in their own way to a drying up of monstrous proportions. With the progressive evaporation of the sea, the water became oversaturated with dissolved salt, and these began to precipitate. Remember the little name of this great catastrophe, the Messinian salinity crisis, during which, for precisely 630,000 years, salt will accumulate, depositing in layers that can locally reach 2,000 meters thick. It is estimated that in this way, nearly 1 million cubic kilometers of evaporates will be deposited, over an area equivalent to 4 times that of France. This amount of salt currently trapped in the deposits that lie in the abyssal plains represents 6% of the total stock of that dissolved in the global ocean. Prodigious huge for most living beings in the water and therefore forced to survive in a sea shrinking like a sorrow skin. When it's not in lakes, hypersalty and isolated puddles, the end is near. But for some species evolving on the continents, these great upheavals will allow them to walk on the bottom of the dried up seas and thus access new territories. A decade ago, fossils of rabbits half a meter tall and weighing some 23 kilograms were discovered. These giant rabbits, to whom we have given the nickname Neuralagus rex, could certainly neither jump nor swim. And yet they were found on the island of Minorca, in the middle of the Mediterranean. In fact, evaporation, by exposing the seafloor, formed vast land bridges connecting Africa, like Europe, to many islands in the Mediterranean. Thus, this was 5.5 million years ago. You could go from Corsica to Sicily, passing through Sardinia on foot. And the ancestors of Neuralagus rex, like those of many other species, took advantage of this to conquer new habitats, new environments. Then, with the rise of the waters, once the land bridges disappeared, isolation led their ancestors, small rabbits, to become giants. Because small animals, finding themselves living in insular environments, rich in resources and devoid of predators, often tend to grow larger, to lean towards gigantism. You will say that this provides no information about a group of large rabbits. What's the connection between the mother's disappearance and the volcanoes? I'm about to explain. In fact, as strange as it may seem, this sea that has receded has also indirectly contributed to making the volcanoes more enraged. Because the absence of a few 2 kilometers of water thickness that pressed on the seafloor had a strange consequence, that of reducing the pressure exerted on the Earth's crust and on the mantle, a region animated by convection currents that evacuate the excess heat of our planet. And this depressurized mantle then partially melted in places, forming deep magma bubbles that rose up to feed many volcanoes, piercing the crust around the dried up sea. And we do observe in the geological layers of this time a resurgence of volcanic activity that will last nearly 700,000 years until an entire sea is reborn from its ashes some 5.3 million years ago. When, thanks to the movement of tectonic plates, violent earthquakes suddenly crack and reopen the Strait of Gibraltar. If we had to give a name to this event, certainly unique in the entire history of the Earth, it would be the flood. According to our latest models, it was a monstrous flow of water that abruptly ended the history of this desert under the seas, filling a reborn Mediterranean in less than 2 years. It is believed that the river of seawater from the Atlantic, which then fell into the virtually empty immense basin, carried some 100 million cubic meters of water per second to the point of raising the level in the Mediterranean basin by nearly 10 meters per day. 5,300 millennia after this deluge, the passage of this gigantic river, with a flow equivalent to 1,000 times that of the Amazon, is still visible today in certain regions of the strait, in the form of a 200-meter deep gash. Elsewhere, the traces left by the diluvian refilling are inscribed in the topography of the deep sea floor. Thus, the data collected by seismic analysis campaigns and the study of alluvial deposits have, for example, shown the presence of a huge erosion channel, several hundred meters deep and stretching over 390 kilometers long, from the Gulf of Cadiz in the Atlantic Ocean to the Algerian Basin. And to make such a cut, to dig such a furrow, it is thought that the roaring rivers must have torn away some 1,000 cubic kilometers of sediments in their path. Further east, nearly 1,000 kilometers away, another canyon was found in the deep sea, near the island of Malta, this one 5 kilometers wide and plunging nearly 1,500 meters into the deep eastern basin. It is thought that it was through here that, after initially filling the western part of the Mediterranean, the water spilled over into the other side, a few hundred kilometers from these underwater cliffs. In the Ionian Sea, 1,600 cubic kilometers of sediments exhibiting all the characteristics of a deposit from a sudden flood phase have been uncovered. And given the well-known principle of communicating vessels, which tells us that when you fill a bathtub, you have to take the water from somewhere, once the flood was over, the overall level of all the planet's oceans had dropped by nearly 6 meters. Soon, with the return of the weight of the water on the Earth's crust, the volcanoes encircling the resurrected sea will return to normal activity, and the rabbits of Menorca will become giants. Red, grey, orange, green, blue or white, the surface of our world has seen all the colours, and the traces of this turbulent history are still very present. They can now be brought back to life by studying the composition of fossils and rocks on which we walk every day. These places have been here, there, under our feet, amazing elsewhere. Simply located elsewhere in time. And even if none of these landscapes now turned to dust has ever been seen by a human being, we have given them names, anchored them in our imagination. And the past has become in our minds a great number of other planets. I was considering how to make the Mediterranean Sea vanish. You just simply have to close it.